Emily was the portrait of quiet dedication and rare competence, a woman who, despite her youth, had already earned a respectable place in the multinational's marketing department. In her early 20s, she displayed a unique creativity, capable of turning abstract concepts into memorable campaigns that not only boosted sales, but also repositioned the brand in demanding and saturated markets. Her professional ethics were impeccable, and her discreet demeanor made the impact she created even more admirable. Without the need for grand speeches or theatrical gestures, she stood out through the precision of her analyses, her aesthetic sensitivity, and her strategic clarity, qualities that made her a silent role model to both colleagues and superiors. There was a natural elegance in her presence, a subtle blend of analytical intelligence and emotional sensitivity, something rare in that cold, competitive, and impersonal environment. Every step of her rise within the company had been built on a solid foundation of effort and resilience. Sleepless nights, exhausting deadlines, presentations to inflexible executives, and the constant need to prove, with each delivery, that her competence was no accident, but a daily commitment to excellence. Emily didn't seek applause or easy recognition. Her greatest motivation came from the personal fulfillment of seeing her projects take shape and gain relevance in the market. Behind this admirable professional, however, was a woman who carefully guarded the separation between personal life and career. Emily avoided any exposure that might weaken the image of strength and commitment she had worked so hard to build. She was discreet during team lunches, reserved in hallway conversations, and always cautious about the fine line separating the professional from the personal. Perhaps that's why the brief relationship she had with Ryan, the company's CEO, remained wrapped in absolute secrecy, far from curious eyes and the inevitable judgment that would arise in such a competitive and hierarchical environment. It was a silent story, lived between furtive encounters and glances that carried the tension of those who knew they were crossing boundaries. The allure of power and the seduction of closeness were irresistible, breaking down the barriers Emily had always imposed on herself. With Ryan, there were no promises or plans for the future, just an intense connection fueled by moments of shared vulnerability and a chemistry that both, for different reasons, preferred to keep confined to the private realm. When the relationship ended, there were no formal explanations or farewells, only silence, which came to inhabit their professional interactions with a painful subtlety. Emily, with her usual discretion, moved on, hiding behind the mask of daily efficiency, the unspoken wounds and the longing that, no matter how much she denied it, still lingered in small gestures, and in the way she avoided making eye contact with Ryan during corporate meetings. Thus, her routine remained intact, yet filled with invisible tension, an unfinished story that, though buried under the weight of responsibilities, still echoed silently in the woman who, more than ever, sought to establish herself not only as an excellent professional, but also as someone who, despite the scars, still believed in new beginnings. The day Emily discovered she was pregnant seemed, at first glance, like just another exhausting day among so many others, marked by the frantic pace of project deliveries and meetings demanding her full attention. From the early hours that morning, however, something felt off. Slight dizziness, persistent nausea, and a strange fatigue that couldn't be explained merely by sleepless nights or the constant pressure of the corporate environment. Although she tried to ignore the signs, focusing on reports and presentations, her intuition subtly alerted her that something was different, something that went beyond the usual physical and emotional strain she was used to. Throughout the day, between one meeting and another, Emily noticed small changes in her body, involuntary reactions that, although subtle, accumulated like pieces of a puzzle she hesitated to complete. When the workday finally ended and silence settled over the once busy hallways, she stayed in her office for a few minutes, staring at her reflection in the glass window with the city lights shimmering in the background. There was a restlessness in her gaze, a silent urgency that no longer allowed her to postpone the doubt that had accompanied her all day. Without anyone noticing, she quietly grabbed her purse and headed to the most isolated bathroom on the floor, the one rarely used, as if the solitude of that space was essential for the moment she was about to face. Inside her bag, hidden among papers and personal items, was the small pharmacy test she had bought the night before, a spontaneous decision she hadn't fully admitted even to herself. As she waited for the result, sitting on the cold bathroom bench, her hands trembling and heart racing, time seemed to stretch cruelly, turning mere minutes into an agonizing eternity. When the result appeared, clear and undeniable, Emily felt a sudden dizziness, as if the solid ground beneath her feet had vanished. The unrelenting clarity of the positive result was both a shock and a revelation, a definitive truth that would forever alter the course of her life. For a moment, everything she had built, her carefully planned career, the walls around her privacy, her rigidly controlled routine, seemed fragile, vulnerable in the face of this new, unexpected, and irreversible reality. But after the first wave of fear and disbelief, Emily felt a different emotion take over, almost inexplicable. She instinctively placed her hands over her still flat belly, and in that quiet gesture, she recognized the existence of something greater than any plan or ambition. A life, a future, a possibility still undefined, yet already pulsing within her with overwhelming force. Confused, torn between fear and tenderness, Emily began to think about Ryan, the man with whom she had lived a brief but intense story, whose imprint still quietly lingered inside her. She wondered, without finding answers, how he would react upon hearing about the pregnancy, whether he would see it as a burden or a gift, whether he would feel part of that new life, or choose to remain distant, as he had done when he abruptly ended their relationship. She didn't yet know if she had the courage to tell him, nor could she imagine when or how the right moment to do so might come. However, in the midst of that uncertainty, a delicate hope began to bloom within Emily, the hope that, regardless of Ryan's choices, she would be capable of embracing and protecting that life with the same dedication and strength that had always guided her steps. And more than that this new existence could represent not an end but a beginning, silent, unexpected, and profoundly transformative. A few days after discovering the pregnancy, while Emily was still immersed in a whirlwind of conflicting emotions, trying to rationally organize her next steps and calmly grasp the magnitude of the life-changing news, an unexpected message broke into her inbox, abruptly interrupting her fragile attempt at stability. The sender was the Human Resources Department, and the content, though brief and procedural, carried an implicit tension that did not go unnoticed. A summons for a meeting with the CEO, scheduled for the following morning in one of the most private rooms in the building. The email, written with the bureaucratic coldness typical of internal corporate communications, provided no details about the purpose of the meeting, only the time, place, and a formal request for confirmation of attendance. Emily reread the message over and over, as if through obsessive repetition she could decode a hidden clue, a subtext capable of easing the restlessness that was instinctively beginning to spread through her mind and body. There was a dryness in the tone, an objectivity that, though familiar in the corporate world, felt strangely impersonal and cutting in this context. For a few minutes, she allowed the darkest possibilities to take shape, an unexpected dismissal, a reprimand for something unknown, or perhaps even the revelation that her pregnancy, still kept in secrecy, had somehow been discovered. But soon, with the emotional discipline she had learned to cultivate over the years, she silenced those thoughts. After all, her trajectory at the company was solid, marked by undeniable competence and outstanding results that had even been publicly recognized in previous meetings, some of which included direct praise from Ryan, whose opinion shaped and influenced much of the corporation's strategic decisions. The possibility that this meeting could represent a tangible advancement in her career, perhaps even the long-desired promotion or the leadership of a new and ambitious project, began to take form in her mind as a plausible and desirable scenario. Gradually, that idea began to ease her anguish and soften the emotional impact of the recent pregnancy discovery, allowing her to breathe with a bit more relief and hope. That night, alone in her quiet apartment, Emily prepared herself with the meticulous rigor that had always accompanied her during decisive moments. She carefully chose a sober outfit that conveyed professionalism and confidence, without betraying the subtle physical discomfort she had begun to feel, a reflection of the silent transformations her body was undergoing. She spent hours mentally reviewing reports, rehearsing arguments, and reinforcing the strong points of the campaigns she had led in recent months, as if every piece of data could serve as a protective shield against any potential judgment or unwelcome surprise. Yet no matter how hard she tried to remain rational and focused, she couldn't stop a discreet thread of hope from sprouting deep in her soul. Perhaps, after the formalities of the meeting, An opportunity would arise between them to resume the interrupted dialogue, to share the news that could forever change not just her life, but Ryan's as well. Maybe that meeting was the right moment to break the silence, to give voice to the life that, silently and delicately, was already beating inside her, transforming her day by day. And so, with her heart torn between unwavering professionalism and a longing for deeper connection, Emily closed the laptop, turned off the lights, and before lying down, placed her hands over her still unnoticeable belly, as if searching, in that silent gesture, for the strength needed to face whatever the next day might bring. The following morning, Emily crossed the company's lobby with the same confidence that had always been her trademark, even though inside, every step was accompanied by subtle anxiety and an indefinable feeling that something was about to change irreversibly. She wore the kind of understated elegance that usually commanded respect among her colleagues, but this time, the carefully chosen fabric seemed unable to shield her from the cold settling in her chest. As she reached the frosted glass door of the meeting room, she took a deep breath before pushing it open, aware that what awaited her there would not be just another routine meeting, but one of those moments that silently divide life into a before and an after. As soon as she stepped into the austere room, she was greeted by a cold and impersonal atmosphere. Ryan was already there, seated at the head of the long glass table, flanked by two representatives from Human Resources, whose expressions were as neutral as the cool tones of the surrounding decor. Emily, who knew Ryan better than anyone else in that room, immediately noticed the excessive rigidity in his posture, the way he kept his arms crossed and his gaze fixed on an indeterminate point in front of him, deliberately avoiding eye contact with her. The man with whom she had shared intense moments, full of unspoken passion and deep complicity, now seemed like a stranger wrapped in an impenetrable armor. Without any preamble or hint of hesitation, Ryan began the meeting with a carefully rehearsed speech, his words aligned with the cold formality required in such processes. He spoke about the need for a strategic restructuring, mentioned the inevitability of cutbacks, the relentless pursuit of efficiency, and the company's adaptation to new market challenges. His tone was mechanical, almost indifferent, as if each sentence were part of a pre-approved script meant to soften the harshness of the decision. Emily, however, perceptive and accustomed to reading not only words but also the silences and gestures that shape them, immediately sensed that there was more behind the official explanation. It wasn't just numbers or charts driving that decision. There was an unspoken discomfort in the way Ryan avoided meeting her eyes, an invisible weight hanging in the room, turning the air into something dense and difficult to breathe. The presence of the HR representatives, with their frozen expressions and neatly stacked papers, only reinforced the bureaucratic nature of the moment, while in essence, it was a termination saturated with a personal story that no one else there seemed or wanted to acknowledge. For a brief and nearly uncontrollable moment, Emily felt the impulse to interrupt him, to break through the formality and ask, with the frankness that had often marked their silent encounters, whether that decision had anything to do with the pregnancy he didn't yet know about, or with the past they had shared, and which, it now seemed, he was trying hard to bury. But she held back. She knew, with the clarity the setting demanded, that any sign of vulnerability could be interpreted as weakness, or worse, as a desperate attempt to fight the inevitable. And so she remained still, her face composed, and her eyes steady, while inside, her heart shattered in silence. She listened to every word until the end, absorbing Ryan's final communication, and then the formal HR instructions about termination procedures, confidentiality clauses, timelines, and guaranteed rights. Everything sounded distant, as if it were being said to someone else, while Emily felt that something much greater than a contract was being ended there, a cycle of dedication, dreams, loyalty, and above all, a story she had believed, at least at some point, to be true. Without uttering a single word, she rose with dignity, gathered the few personal items she kept in the room, a modest picture frame with a photograph from a company event, some technical books, and notebooks filled with meticulous notes from the projects into which she had poured countless hours of work and passion. She placed everything carefully into a cardboard box, performing each movement with the precision of someone who, though wounded, refuses to let her sorrow be perceived by others. As she left the room, She crossed the lobby again. What had seemed familiar and welcoming that morning now felt indifferent, almost hostile. She passed through reception, pushed the revolving door, and as she stepped onto the sidewalk, she felt the first raindrops touch her skin, as if the sky itself, a silent witness to her pain, were weeping too. Each step she took carried the weight not only of injustice and rejection, but also of a silent and irrevocable decision to move forward, to protect herself and, above all, the life now growing inside her, a life invisible to the world, but already undeniably real, pulsing, and perhaps the only certainty that despite everything, a future still existed and was worth living. The rain, constant and quiet, wasn't just a melancholic backdrop on that gray afternoon. It was a perfect reflection of what was happening inside Emily. Each drop running down her skin seemed to carry a bit of the pain she worked so hard to hide. The heavy, colorless sky seemed to understand her like no one else at that moment, as if it cried for her at the exact instant everything was falling apart. There were no thunderclaps or strong winds, just that fine, persistent rain that washed the city with a merciless tenderness. It was as if the world around her was being purified, while inside her grew a conflicted feeling of loss and transition. The wet streets, reflecting the city's blurry lights, became almost surreal, like a movie scene where the protagonist walks alone after a cruel twist. And in a way, that's exactly what Emily was becoming, a character in her own story, newly thrown out of the script she had so carefully planned. The rain took on the role of a silent narrator, speaking, in drops and silences, everything she couldn't express in words. The cold water seeped into her clothes, plastered her hair to her face, but she didn't retreat. She didn't seek shelter or try to protect herself. She surrendered to the moment, as if she deserved every drop, as if that steady, liquid pain also washed away the guilt she secretly carried. It was a rain that did not judge, that merely accompanied, embraced, and made the weight of an unexpected farewell more bearable. And despite its coldness, it held a strange kind of tenderness, as if telling Emily it was okay to suffer, that it was human to feel lost. That morning a dream left unfulfilled didn't need to be hidden beneath the mask of strength. In that rain-soaked setting, the city seemed to revolve around her, yet without truly seeing her. The honking, the hurried footsteps, the umbrellas passing by her side, everything followed its usual course, indifferent to the pain pulsing inside her. And paradoxically, it was that very indifference that made her realize how alive she still was, feeling, breathing, existing. The rain, which could have been just another external element, became the most intimate symbol of what Emily was going through. A moment of rupture, yes, but also one of preparation, because even the longest rains eventually stop, and when the sun finally returns, everything touched by the water blooms in a different way. Months after the layoff, Emily was no longer the same woman who had walked through the doors of her old company in the rain. Time hadn't erased the scars, but it had hardened her shell and ignited a quiet yet persistent flame inside her. The pregnancy, which initially seemed like a lonely and frightening challenge, had now become her main reason to endure, transform, and start again. Every rejection after sending out resumes no longer shook her as it once did. She had learned not to take silence as a sentence, nor rejection as a measure of her worth. But that morning, something felt different. The offer came from a small strategic consultancy, located in a modest office complex, away from the hub of major corporations. It didn't promise luxury or a high salary, but there was an honesty in the opportunity, and an intuition in Emily telling her not to let it pass. She wore her best business outfit, the same one from past failed attempts, but this time something in her stance was more grounded. The fatigue was still there, as were the doubts, but there was also courage, the kind that arises when you have someone to protect, even if they haven't been born yet. Sitting in the reception area, she watched employees come and go, took in the simple decor, the motivational posters on the walls. She held the folder with her documents tightly against her chest, not so much for security, but as if, in that gesture, she was gathering all she still had to offer: her story, her skills, and her will to succeed. When she was finally called, she walked to the room with measured steps, feeling her heart beat to the rhythm of an ancient drum. The man who greeted her, Daniel, didn't wear an expensive suit, or carry himself with arrogance. He was composed, direct, and attentive. He greeted her firmly, but without haste. During the interview, as she spoke about her experience in corporate marketing, the projects she had led, the courses she took even after being laid off, and the pregnancy that motivated her but didn't define her, Daniel didn't just listen. He saw her. Unlike the looks that silently judged her for being pregnant, Daniel saw beyond the rounded belly. He noticed the resilience in her eyes, the clarity in how she organized her thoughts, the maturity that emerged between concise phrases and objective data. Emily wasn't selling promises. She offered consistency, a woman who understood the weight of choices, who had been broken and yet was still there, whole enough to begin again. At the end of the conversation, Daniel didn't fall back on rehearsed lines. He simply closed the folder, crossed his arms, and said with a subtle half-smile that he believed in her. He offered her the junior analyst position, with room to grow, learn, and show who she truly was. Emily was speechless for a few seconds, her throat tightening with an emotion she had tried to contain since the morning began. It wasn't just a job. It was a door, a legitimate chance to rebuild her life with dignity. On her way out, as she crossed the reception once again, Emily gently touched her belly, as she did in the most decisive moments. There was the reason she hadn't given up, and unknowingly, she had just taken the first step toward becoming the woman who was about to bloom, no longer driven by the pain of loss, but by the living hope of a future that was finally beginning to take shape. In the months that followed, the relationship between Emily and Daniel evolved gradually, gaining nuances that went far beyond a simple professional hierarchy. What started as a leader and employee bond turned into a partnership built on trust, mutual respect, and growing admiration. Daniel, with his solid experience in the business world, soon realized that Emily wasn't just an efficient employee. She was exceptional. She had an uncommon strategic intelligence paired with a rare sensitivity that allowed her to see innovative solutions where others saw only problems. He, who always believed in the power of human capital, found in Emily not just a promising talent, but an ally beyond operational tasks. He began including her in important decisions, investor meetings, and presentations to key clients. And even when tasks demanded more than she thought she could offer, Daniel was there, not to pressure, but to guide, adjust the course, and offer alternatives. He became a true mentor, not just technically, but as a model of integrity, patience, and empathetic leadership. For Emily, all of this was new and deeply transformative. Used to the competitive and impersonal environment of her former company, where she even had to hide a past relationship with one of the directors, she now found herself in a place where she could be who she was, with her scars, but also with her light. Every day, she rediscovered her own abilities and regained something essential that had been worn away over time: her faith in herself. In the workplace, Emily and Daniel developed a fluid dynamic, marked by active listening, honest exchange, and appreciation of ideas. There was a quiet, almost intuitive admiration between them that required no formalities. It wasn't favoritism or any questionable relationship. It was the legitimate recognition of complementary strengths. He trusted her, and she gave even more of herself, not out of obligation, but out of gratitude and purpose. As the company grew, partly driven by the innovative solutions Emily proposed, her own path rose as well. She advanced from junior analyst to coordinator, then project manager, and within less than 2 years, she was stepping into a strategic role alongside Daniel, participating in decisions that shaped the future of the consultancy. Her name was no longer just remembered internally. It was recognized in the market, on panels, in publications, and in meetings with major clients. More than a professional rise, that journey was an intimate healing. Emily, who had been coldly discarded by a company and a relationship she had deeply valued, was now building a solid career grounded in merit, genuine support, and real opportunities. And the friendship that blossomed between her and Daniel became an emotional anchor amidst the demands of corporate life and motherhood. There was a rare kind of connection between them, the kind that doesn't need promises or explanations. It simply existed. Daniel had become the first man, in a very long time, to ask nothing in return for believing in her. And for Emily, that meant everything, because finally, she understood that it was possible to begin again, and more than that, to flourish, even after the greatest falls. Over the years, Emily not only solidified her career, she reinvented it. Unconditionally supported by Daniel, who remained by her side as a mentor, partner, and friend, she realized it was time to push herself even further. It was Daniel who encouraged her to apply for an MBA at one of the country's most prestigious universities, convinced she was ready to take that leap. Emily, with the same courage that had guided her so far, accepted the challenge. Throughout the program, she immersed herself deeply in her studies. More than refining techniques, she transformed her mindset. She came to understand the role of a leader in today's world, developed high-level strategic thinking, and expanded her network far beyond national borders. She participated in international forums, interacted with executives from different cultures, and in each exchange, absorbed something new. She took courses in Europe and Asia, visited financial centers like London, Singapore, and New York, where she discovered innovative practices and management models that changed the way she viewed business. When she returned, Emily was no longer the same. She was more grounded, more ambitious, and above all, more aware of her own worth. With Daniel's unwavering support, she made a decision that had once seemed too bold: to launch her own consulting firm. It was a symbolic step, not just of independence, but of maturity. Daniel believed in the project from the start. He provided initial capital, shared strategic contacts, and made a point of staying close during the first months of the new company, serving as a senior advisor and minority partner. Within a few years, the consulting firm stood out. With an agile model focused on listening to clients and offering tailored solutions, it became a national benchmark. Companies in crisis sought Emily for her reputation of solving the impossible. Her leadership was defined by firmness and empathy, and her team, mostly made up of professionals she had helped train, reflected her values, ethics, innovation, and a commitment to sustainable results. The business press began following her with interest. Profiles in major business magazines told her inspiring story, highlighting not just her technical skill, but her remarkable resilience. Emily began speaking at universities, was invited to advisory boards of major corporations, and became a role model for women striving to balance motherhood, leadership, and purpose. The past, that rainy day when she walked out of a company with a box in her arms and a child in her womb, now felt like a distant echo, a memory that, though still alive in her mind, served only as a reminder of how far she had come. Emily had not only overcome pain and abandonment, she built an empire from her own strength, turning every scar into fuel and every challenge into a new opportunity. She had, at last, become the woman she was always meant to be. Over time, the relationship between Emily and Daniel blossomed with a naturalness that needed no grand declarations. The affection that grew between them was quiet, but deeply rooted in everything they had built side by side. Successful projects, tough decisions, exhausting days followed by words of encouragement, and silent nights filled with mutual understanding. Love didn't strike like lightning. It burned like a steady flame, slowly ignited and strengthened by the respect, admiration, and trust they had cultivated over the years. Daniel saw in Emily not only the brilliant leader he had helped to elevate, but also the resilient, sensitive woman who had risen from her own ashes. Emily saw in him much more than a mentor or partner. He was her source of stability, her anchor on difficult days, and the only one who had truly seen her from the beginning, with all her pain, power, and scars. Their first kiss didn't happen on a special occasion. It came after a long, quiet meeting, when their eyes met for longer than usual, and no words were needed. They both knew that what they felt could no longer be held back. When they allowed themselves to live that love, they did so without fear or impulsive promises. It was a calm, secure dive, the kind taken by those who know exactly what they're building, a relationship based on freedom, truth, and companionship. For Emily, rediscovering the possibility of loving without fear was transformative. After facing abandonment, prejudice, and the loneliness of single motherhood, experiencing a love rooted in acceptance, respect, and peace felt like an emotional rebirth. She was no longer the woman asking for space or recognition. Now, she was the woman firmly choosing what she deserved to live. Daniel not only embraced this new chapter with maturity, but also welcomed Emily's daughter with genuine love. He became an essential figure in the girl's life, supporting her growth with the same dedication he gave to the relationship. He was present in the small things: Sunday lunches, advice before exams, bedtime stories. For him, fatherhood wasn't an obligation, but a privilege he embraced with an open heart. Together, the home they built became a refuge of peace, affection, and balance. Emily, who once walked through the city in the rain, clutching a box and a broken heart, now smiled through family dinners, weekend getaways, and shared plans with someone who truly loved her. What was once pain became a foundation. What once seemed like the end became a new beginning. Emily discovered that happiness was possible, not by chance, but by merit. She had fought, grown, and finally allowed herself to live the fullness of a calm, solid, and real love. After years of walking a path marked by courage, strategy, and resilience, Emily and Daniel faced the most challenging proposal of their careers: the acquisition of a major corporation on the brink of collapse, yet with valuable assets and enormous restructuring potential. To most investors, it would be a risky move. For them, a clear opportunity for market expansion and consolidation. However, for Emily, that negotiation carried a weight beyond spreadsheets and financial projections. As soon as the company's name appeared in preliminary meetings, a chill ran down her spine. It was in that same gray and imposing building that her professional story had begun. It was there she had been coldly dismissed when she needed support the most. The name Ryan, her former boss, the man who discarded her as if she were just another number, appeared in internal reports as the last CEO of the company before the crisis. The memory of that rainy day, walking out of the building with a box in her arms and a shattered soul, came back with disturbing clarity. But this time, Emily was different. She was no longer the invisible young woman. She was a solid leader, in charge of her own destiny. Daniel, attentive and intuitive, noticed the silent turmoil. He didn't pressure her, nor did he ask if she wanted to walk away. He knew that Emily, despite the emotions bubbling beneath the surface, was rational and strategic. And more than that, he knew this acquisition wouldn't just be a business decision. It would be the chance to transform old pain into tangible accomplishment. In the weeks that followed, they dove together into reports, contracts, and restructuring possibilities. Emily led the analyses with firmness and composure, though inside she was fighting a quiet battle, not against Ryan, but against the shadow he represented, the shadow of insecurity that once made her doubt herself. When the contract was signed, Emily requested to visit the company headquarters in person. Walking through the halls she once knew so well, every detail triggered a dormant memory. But now everything seemed smaller, almost irrelevant compared to the woman she had become. Upon arriving at the main meeting room, she found Ryan seated at the table, waiting for the new management, unaware that she was part of it. The reunion was silent, professional. Emily didn't flaunt her success or harbor resentment. She simply presented the restructuring plan with clarity and confidence, demonstrating total command of the situation. Ryan could hardly hide his shock at seeing her there. So secure, so powerful, so different from the woman he had dismissed years before. There was no direct confrontation, no harsh words. Emily didn't need that. Her presence was the answer. Her story spoke for itself. That acquisition, beyond being strategic, became an emotional milestone, confirmation that she had won, not against someone, but against what others tried to make her believe she was. As she left the building, now as co-owner of the company, Emily felt the weight of the past finally dissolve. There was no bitterness left, only the calm certainty that everything she had lived through had prepared her for that moment. She smiled, not out of triumph, but because of freedom, because of the peace that comes from turning pain into strength, fear into courage, and rejection into fuel to soar even higher. At the old company, once a symbol of excellence and constant growth, the atmosphere had turned gloomy and filled with uncertainty. The walls that once vibrated with the excitement of achieved goals and celebrated innovations now seemed to absorb the fearful whispers of the staff. The announcement of the impending acquisition hung over everyone like a heavy cloud, and each step echoed through the halls like a sign of something irreversible. What was once familiar had become unstable. People avoided eye contact, smiles faded, and the daily routine was carried out with the caution of someone walking on fragile ground. Ryan, who for years had represented the face of leadership, now walked the company halls with slower steps and a tired expression. His authority, once unquestioned, was now just a memory slowly fading in the indifferent gazes of the employees. He felt it, and it hurt. He was no longer seen as a figure of inspiration, but as the symbol of a leadership that had, over time, lost its grip on reality and its connection to people. The silence around him wasn't respect, it was distance. It reflected broken relationships, arbitrary decisions, and the arrogance of someone who once believed that titles define character. More than the loss of results or market prestige, what haunted him most was the memory of Emily, not as the efficient professional he once let go, but as the woman whose quiet presence had carried a strength he failed to recognize or value. Ryan now wondered, amid the piles of papers in his office, if that one cold decision had been the breaking point. The company had started declining shortly after, and although many factors were involved, deep down he knew that losing Emily had meant losing something essential: the chance to renew the company's culture with a genuine, sensitive, and transformative leader. As he sank deeper into remorse, the team remained on high alert. Rumors circulated. Some said it would be a foreign group, others bet on a merger with competitors. But no one expected that the new name at the head of the organization would carry a story intertwined with the very hallways of that same building. That the woman who once left there unnoticed, with teary eyes and her dignity intact, would return with a new title, a new posture, and a new mission: to rebuild, not with revenge, but with competence and vision. Tension peaked on the morning of the announcement. Employees gathered in the main auditorium, where for years they had heard goals, demands, and promises that never came true. And when the new CEO finally took the stage, an almost imperceptible murmur swept through the crowd. Emily was there, confident, elegant, serene, and at that moment, even before saying a single word, the past was redefined, not as an open wound, but as the foundation of a new story, a story she was now writing herself, with courage, integrity, and the leadership everyone longed to find again. Emily crossed the main entrance of the building like someone returning to the starting point, not to restart, but to show she had arrived at the right destination. Her firm steps, guided by years of silent struggle, carried more than authority. They carried the presence of a woman who had risen from the ashes, quietly, without fanfare, only with the strength of one who rebuilt herself with dignity. Alongside Daniel, her partner and life companion, she radiated an aura of respect and balance, as if they both embodied success earned through integrity. The lobby, filled with curious and discreet glances, fell silent at Emily's presence. The employees who whispered about the new owners were instantly and almost instinctively filled with respect. There was something about the way she walked, her upright posture, her calm gaze, that spoke louder than any formal announcement. She belonged there, not by imposition, but by absolute merit. Every step she took echoed as a silent answer to the doubts that once hung over her competence. When she entered the conference room, where the main executives awaited the presentation of the new leadership, the atmosphere seemed to freeze for a moment. Ryan, still seated at the head of the table, perhaps out of habit, perhaps out of stubbornness, felt the air thin the moment he saw her. There was no doubt, no room for confusion. Emily was back, but not as the young woman quietly and cowardly fired, rather as the new CEO, as the woman who, even though pushed out the back door, returned through the front, greeted not with applause, but with silent reverence. The impact was immediate. Ryan turned pale, feeling the blood drain from his face. The woman he once underestimated, whom he ignored on a rainy afternoon without even allowing her a dignified farewell, now sat at the head of the table, in a leadership position, in front of him. But what unsettled him the most was not her rise, but the way she ignored him, not with disdain, but with the serenity of someone who had already overcome everything he could represent. Emily did not look at him with bitterness. She didn't throw insults or hesitate even once. Her posture was that of a complete leader, confident, centered, with no room for the past to interfere in the future she had decided to build. Her voice, when she addressed the team, sounded clear, firm, and inspiring. She spoke about purpose, about restructuring, about trust. No mention of what had happened years ago, because for her, this moment was not about revenge. It was about transformation. And it was in this detail that Ryan realized how much he had lost. While he still fought his own ghosts, trying to remain relevant in a structure that crumbled before his eyes. Emily had already moved beyond all that. She had won, not by taking his seat, but by earning the genuine respect of everyone around her. Unlike him, who had isolated himself in his ego, she built alliances, healed wounds, and moved forward with purpose. That day, not just a new management began. A new cycle of leadership, empathy, and competence was born. And without saying a single word to Ryan, Emily made clear the most powerful message he could receive. True success requires no revenge. It blooms silently, in front of the eyes of those who once doubted. In the crowded conference room, time seemed to slow down. Eyes turned to Emily with a mix of expectation and restrained surprise. It was hard to associate that imposing figure with the young woman who, years earlier, had left that very company carrying a box and a lump in her throat. But she was there, not as someone who returned to claim something, but as the professional who earned her place by merit, by competence, and by the integrity with which she charted her journey since then. With a slight nod, Emily began her presentation. No sign of hesitation, no crack in her posture. She wore the serenity of someone who knew this moment was not only a professional victory, but also a turning point in her own story. Her voice filled the room with clarity and presence, and every word chosen with precision served a greater purpose: to rebuild not just a company in ruins, but an entire culture that for years had neglected the values that truly sustain an organization. Her restructuring plan was bold. Cuts would be necessary, yes, but not just in costs, also in archaic practices, toxic leadership, and internal politics that had eroded the company's foundation. Emily spoke about ethics as naturally as others spoke about profit. She stated firmly that an environment where respect is not the rule cannot thrive, no matter how innovative the product or service offered. As she spoke about valuing talent, her voice took on a deeper, almost imperceptible tone, enough for some to catch the subtext. She spoke to everyone, but hit squarely the one who once decided she was not enough. Emily didn't need to mention him. Her mere presence, combined with the clarity of her leadership, was a mirror where Ryan was forced to face everything he had neglected, including himself. Ryan, sitting among directors who until recently revered his command, could barely hide his discomfort. His body stiff, hands clenched tightly, gaze fixed on an indefinite point on the table, all betrayed an inner turmoil that contrasted with Emily's absolute serenity. He listened, but what he really absorbed were the silences between the phrases, the subtle messages that, though veiled, struck with the precision of a verdict. Emily, on the other hand, remained unaffected. She had learned to master her own impulses, to channel emotion in a constructive direction. The past that once hurt her was now merely fuel for clear decisions. At the end of her presentation, she concluded with something that wasn't on the slides or in the reports: a call to awareness. She said a new era was beginning, one in which power would no longer be defined by titles or last names, but by the ability to serve with truth, to lead with empathy, and to grow alongside others, not at their expense. The silence that followed wasn't hesitation, it was impact. Emily hadn't shouted, accused, or raised her voice, and yet her presence was the most powerful response to the injustice she had once endured. The message was delivered with the elegance of someone who doesn't need revenge because they've already won by becoming exactly who they were, once told they could never be. And in that moment, without fanfare, she redefined not only the course of the company, but the very concept of leadership for everyone in that room. When the meeting came to an end, the sounds of chairs being pushed back and papers being gathered filled the room. As the executives exited one by one, some still exchanging discreet glances and whispering comments about the new leadership they had just witnessed. It was as if they hadn't just seen a change in management, but the beginning of a new era, an era led by someone whose presence, underestimated by many until then, now commanded undeniable authority and ease. Emily remained still for a few moments, watching the orderly departure, holding on to the serenity she had built over the years, and that now solidified before that emblematic scene. Everyone left, except Ryan. He remained seated at the far end of the table, his expression blank, eyes fixed on an undefined point ahead, as if trying to grasp the magnitude of what had just occurred. The man who once dismissed her coldly, ignoring her potential, her dedication, and her voice, now found himself reduced to a silent spectator, powerless in the face of the strength she had earned through effort, resilience, and strategic vision. It was impossible to ignore the quiet irony of the moment. Emily had not only overcome the barriers imposed upon her, she had become the leader he had never been able to see. The room, filled just minutes earlier with formality and tension, now seemed to echo only the silence between the two. But that silence spoke far more than any fiery speech could. Emily then stood, calmly arranged some papers on the table, and before leaving, cast a brief glance in his direction. There was no arrogance or bitterness in that gesture, only a restrained and graceful expression, marked by mature serenity and unshakable confidence. Her gaze didn't seek confrontation or revenge. It simply sealed, gently, a chapter closed. A small, discreet smile formed on her lips, not as a provocation, but as the quiet sign of someone who had overcome the past and chosen to move forward with dignity. It wasn't a victory over someone, but a triumph within herself. It reflected years of being doubted, overlooked, and still, she kept going, building, growing. Without saying a word, she turned and walked out of the room, leaving Ryan alone, still paralyzed, engulfed in a silence that seemed heavier than any accusation. And so, with that final look, not only the meeting came to an end, but also a painful chapter in Emily's life. A chapter of submission, doubt, and swallowed silence. A chapter she now left behind for good. The sound of her firm steps echoing down the corridor was the symbol of a new phase. Not just in her career, but in her personal story. A story that, from now on, would be told on her own terms. As she crossed the company's grand entrance hall, the place that, years ago, symbolized one of the greatest wounds of her life, Emily felt a slight chill run down her spine. It wasn't fear, nor insecurity. It was the full awareness that this place, for so long tied to pain, rejection, and silence, no longer held power over her. It was just a building, a structure of glass, steel, and memories that finally no longer imprisoned her. And there, in front of those doors, as a symbol of everything that had changed, stood Daniel waiting for her. He awaited her with a calm and confident smile, the same smile that had offered her support so many times during the hardest moments, when everything seemed to be falling apart. The same smile that never demanded explanations, never sought answers, only welcomed. Seeing that face at that moment, in that place, was more than comforting. It was a living reminder that love, partnership, and resilience can grow even in the harshest conditions. Without saying a word, he reached out his hand, and she, without hesitation, intertwined her fingers with his. A simple gesture, but one full of meaning. There was no spectacle, no grand words, only the solid presence of someone who had been there for her when almost no one else was. They walked side by side toward the exit, under the watchful eyes of employees and executives who, in silence, witnessed the strength of that woman who had returned not as a victim, but as a victor. Emily kept her gaze steady, her steps confident, her posture upright. Each step she took was a silent affirmation of resilience, not revenge, but redemption. It was the story she had rewritten herself, line by line, with effort, tears, and difficult choices. And now, as she walked through that once hostile space, she carried not only the dignity she had reclaimed, but also the deep respect of everyone who watched her. When she crossed the glass door and felt the fresh air touch her face, she paused for a brief moment, not out of hesitation, but like someone who wants to mark, in time and in the soul, the exact moment when something ends forever. She looked around, took a deep breath, and for a second, allowed herself to look back. But there was no sadness in that gesture. There was only the quiet certainty that that chapter was definitively closed. She no longer needed to prove anything to anyone, nor carry the weight of old judgments. At her side, Daniel gently squeezed her hand, a subtle but powerful gesture, a reminder that she was not alone, that there was love and partnership waiting beyond the cycle that had now come to an end. A new chapter was opening before them, full of possibilities, dreams, and choices free of ties. And so, they walked together down the sidewalk, hand in hand, under the soft light of the late afternoon. The city pulsed around them, indifferent and alive, as it always had. But for Emily, everything had changed. Her eyes were fixed ahead, walking with the serenity of someone who had finally overcome every scar and chosen, with courage, the path of happiness. The past no longer defined her. It was part of her story, but not of her destiny. What mattered now was what was to come, and she was ready. Emily's story ends as a silent tribute to the human strength to begin again, to transform pain into learning and abandonment into fuel for victory. She wasn't shaped only by triumphs, but also by the falls that forced her to dive deep into herself, rebuild her identity, and redefine her purpose. And it is exactly in that reconstruction that her true greatness lies. The silence with which she ends this chapter speaks louder than any fiery speech or planned revenge. It is a mature silence, filled with wisdom, that reveals a woman who understood that overcoming doesn't require applause, only courage. The final narration echoes softly, like a whisper from someone who no longer needs to prove anything to anyone. Emily understood that true triumph isn't found in revenge, but in the ability to move forward with dignity. While many expected her to bow to the pain she faced, she chose to forge new paths that led her not only to professional success, but above all, to a reconnection with her own worth. And that is perhaps the quietest and most powerful victory one can achieve. Emily didn't need to demand explanations or feed resentment. She understood that clinging to the past is a waste of the energy needed to build a better future. Her greatest achievement was rising above the circumstances that once diminished her, reinventing herself with integrity, and, in the process, finding a mature, secure love based on mutual respect and true partnership. With Daniel, there were no games, no empty promises, no power struggles. There was understanding, loyalty, and space for her to bloom fully. She discovered by herself that suffering, as devastating as it may seem, is only a season, sometimes dark, cold, and silent, but never permanent. By embracing her pain and turning it into strength, Emily found herself. And in finding herself, she was able to reach everything that once seemed impossible: recognition, balance, love, peace. In the end, what remains is not the image of a woman who returned for revenge, but of someone who came back whole. A woman who leads with empathy, who inspires without fanfare, who refuses to be defined by others' mistakes. A woman who not only survived but blossomed. And in that blossoming, she became a beacon for others, women and men who were also underestimated, ignored, or wounded on their journeys. Life, with all its unpredictable twists, had given her far more than she had dreamed: professional fulfillment, emotional stability, and a sincere love that embraced not only the woman she became, but also the devoted mother she had always been, the one who fought in silence, who took root in the middle of the storm, and who now reaps the fruits of her resilience. Thus, the final message stands as an invitation to reflection. Happiness is not in striking back, but in blooming where many said there was no life left. And Emily bloomed, whole, sovereign, in full command of herself. She proved that even when the world falls apart, there is always a bright future waiting for those who refuse to give up. Her story does not end with a period, but with a hopeful comma, a sign that the best is still to come for those who choose to begin again.